Hello, everyone. It's the IDRH DigitalKS podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. I am your host, David Tamez, and on our first episode, we are speaking with Dr. James Yeku. Dr. James Yeku is an assistant professor for the Department of African and African American Studies. He is also one of the first professors hired specifically with the goal of expanding the growing field of digital humanities here at KU. The DigitalKS podcast is produced by the University of Kansas and the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, IDRH for short. We hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of IDRH Podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. The IDRH podcast is produced by the University of Kansas and the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, IDRH for short. I'm your host, David Tamez, and our very first guest is Dr. James Yeku. Dr. Yeku, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dave. It's nice to be here.
To begin, I'd like to if you don't mind, speaking a little bit about what your research interests are and why you chose them. Was there a moment when you decided this is what you wanted to study, and what was that journey like?
Okay, thanks. That's really a good question to begin off with. I have a background in English and performance studies, one that enabled me to do research on oral forms such as the Trickster. So I was interested in the appearance of the Trickster in new media environments and how the Trickster figure from oral tradition is being repurposed by many guys online who have some technical skills to represent the Trickster figure in the internet environment. And at that point, I did a conference paper that eventually went on to win a major award. And I thought that could be the seed for a major research that would eventually situate my work in the digital humanities. So I left Nigeria for Canada, and very fast things changed. So rather than writing a dissertation on the reappearance of the Trickster in new digital worlds, I ended up writing on social media because the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street at that point were the thing. And my dissertation eventually went on to capture the Nigerian localization of some of these global movements. And since then, I've been invested in terms of the particularities of my research in the digital articulation of the African cultural record in terms of how literary and cultural texts and traditions from around the African continent are expressed in digital contexts. So the way I describe my research interest is to think of it in terms of the digital expression of African literary and cultural productions with specific interest in Nigerian forms.
And is your original interest in the Trickster and its representation, is that something you plan on returning to or would like to return to?
I actually wrote, I went on to develop this conference paper I did many years ago into a full-fledged journal article, and I have since left that work I've since left that work, hoping to probably go back to it at some point, maybe develop it in more productive ways. But I find it was a fad at that point that may no longer be be relevant now. But at that particular moment, the expression that comes to mind is Raymond Williams's structure feeling. It was more like a cultural moment in which social media and digital technologies had become a thing, and that particular fad was more like an outgrowth of that. And my research was to capture that for that particular time, since it's defined how very inventive young people were using social media and digital technologies to comment on culture and society by investing in forms such as a Trickster and other cultural modes of speaking back to what was happening around them.
And that sort of brings me to this question, sort of going out of order with the question, because I think this flows better. How are digital spaces imagined or formulated or developed in sort of African digital ecologies or interactions?
So my sense of this is to think about digital spaces a bit narrowly, and I would refer particularly to social media. Why not forgetting that there are other digital ecologies outside of social media, even in an African context? The people who are invested in using video games to speak to crises such as Boko Haram, or even a crisis of migration in Eastern Africa. So there are guys who develop gaming apps or just an app that allows people to do all kinds of stuff with the kind of crisis and experiential realities they are confronted with. But I find, however, that social media has been the most dominant digital environment for many people in Africa in recent times to be able to speak back to society and reclaim some form of agency because of the affordances, the connective affordances of social media that allow some forms of self-publishing and self-writing. Many people are able to participate more effectively in the public sphere. And the implication of this is that you have more involved citizens in Africa who will make their voice count in matters that affect them. So why social media has been the most dominant digital ecology in recent years? And of course, we find examples of the reinvigoration of the public sphere in Roads Must Fall, or Fees Must Fall in South Africa, would bring back our girls in Nigeria, or Someone Tell CNN in Kenya. And as a matter of fact, many other African countries give you this idea that you have an informed and vibrant public sphere that is animated by the passions of young people who have access to the internet. But on the other hand, you also have other digital spaces such as gaming and as a matter of fact, I'm thinking of the visit by Mark Zuckerberg to Lagos, I think 2 years ago, to visit a group of guys who develop apps and other kinds of technologies that support what Facebook does in terms of its infrastructure. So you definitely have quite a number of digital spaces in which people are able to project and affirm their own voice. But social media seems to have been the most dominant, especially in terms of its political uses.
And so it seems like they use it to either recreate or develop a more robust public sphere where they can protest and have these important political discussions. Does that mean that that makes me think that it might be that the sort of discussions that happen on there are a little bit more fruitful, I guess, than you might find in the more westernized sort of Twitter interactions or social media interactions?
Yeah, that's something valid to. I mean, that's a valid way to put that, especially when you think about it in terms of the nature of society itself in places like Africa and other developing countries around the world, where the voice of the people has not always been affirmed. One of my arguments in my thought on social media is that as long as you have a repressive government, maybe you can think of, well, before now Cuba, you probably think of North Korea. And these are extreme cases. I know you think of China. But for places like Nigeria, what I can say, without necessarily comparing Nigeria and some other developing countries in Africa with these autocratic countries, what I can say is there's this sense that the voice of young people, the voice of marginalized communities, has been invigorated because of social media. Not in the same way as I find it in the West. In countries where the voices of the subaltern have not always been empowered, of course, that's why they're subaltern, then you find social media being a major rallying point, a major hub, as it were, through which people have found this newly found political power and political agency. It's not the same way it is expressed in the West. And in the West, you probably find people who use social media more for friendly interactions. And I'm not saying there aren't people online who express their political ideologies on Facebook, but I find that sense of political agency more in developing nations. And I think it's because in some of these countries, the voice of ordinary people has not always been prominent in the public sphere. So social media becomes that environment in which people can reassert an unheard voice, so to speak.
And going a little bit back to digital humanities specifically, what are some of the virtues or benefits digital humanities has to offer academic research and pedagogy that you've come across?
The first answer to that for me would be to think about the nature of historical education across Africa and our attitude to history and the idea of record keeping, preserving the wealth of cultural records all across the continent. In many parts of Africa, I would imagine that because of the lack of infrastructure, the attitude to history is almost a porous one, to the extent that a field such as the digital humanities can help recalibrate the dying and precarious states of institutions such as the archive or even the museum. So that's just one example of what I think could be a virtue of the digital humanities in an African context. Again, beyond social media, which is an important area of my own research, I am of the view that Africans and African studies scholars need to invest in building platforms from which they invest in some form of preservation of the past, in some form of an investment in the past that is relevant beyond the now. So an example would be to think about the visibility of African studies research across the continent. So it may be the case that books published on Africa and in Africa may be more obtainable in the West than you would find them in Africa itself. So with open access, possibilities for open access through DH platforms, I think that can be another major contribution of DH to the publishing landscape. The most important thing I find, again, to go back to agency, is the capacity for self-writing, self-publication. And I say this understanding the politics of the platforms themselves. So whether it's Google or Facebook or any of the internet providers, of course, technologies and tools are embedded in political ideologies. And that is probably the more reason for which African educators, African scholars need to invest in building their own platforms to be able to capture the kind of to be able to capture and circulate, make more visible the kind of works they're doing.
And so from your response, I hear sort of two things, but they both have to do with epistemology, or so on one hand, it's the preservation of knowledge of Africa.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and then it's the other side of that is the development and the nurturing of knowledge so the preserving the past and past epistemologies, and then the further development of developing knowledge and developing a history and narrative for Africa. And so there's this sense of democratization that DH has to offer. Speaking of epistemologies, I thought it might be interesting, at least for me as a philosopher, because in philosophy, epistemology is used in a particular way, and it might be used differently in other fields. But one area or one sort of interesting discussion in philosophy that occurs is the differences in the way that members of a particular culture develop knowledge and learn. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the differences that you've come across between the way that citizens and people in Africa come to know things, know their world, versus more Western culture. Versus Western epistemologies, the way that Western countries tend to come by knowledge.
Now, that appears to me to be a really vast question, and I must, recognize my own specific positionality as a Nigerian, and that means I will have to invoke examples and paradigms from the culture and country I'm most familiar with. But again, you're right. The idea of epistemology from an Africanist context is one that is really huge and radically different from what you have in a Western context. But my sense of this is perhaps to invoke an idea from the Yoruba of Southwest Nigeria, and I'm invoking this idea for the specific reason that it connects to what we do in DH. And it's the famous divination system that is known as Ifa, the Ifa literary corpus, which is basically a philosophical system that is based on divination. But the beautiful thing about Ifa is that it is also based on mathematical formulas. And you have computer scientists back in Nigeria who have done research on this in order to make the mathematical and scientific approaches to Ifa something more relevant beyond a divination context. Now, there's a scientific epistemological foundations of that I think may be relevant to what I do as somebody who is a DH scholar. Initially, however, my approach in terms of engagement with Ifa my initial approach, I should say, was to look at it from a literary and cultural perspective. The diviner will chant the Ifa corpus is invested in some form of performance. And as a literary scholar, my initial approach was to just look at the various epistemic sites that arise from the spiritual and divinatory practices at work. But as a DH scholar, I think there are more grounds for epistemological explorations if you have something as vast as a Ifa corpus in an open source platform online that can be accessed by a whole lot of people. That, of course, desacralizes this particular divinatory corpus, but it also means that its wealth of knowledge is made available to a large number of people. And I say that because the IFA divination system is perhaps one of the most robust philosophical systems in the world. Okay. And it's the storehouse of what you would call Yoruba knowledge and ontology, epistemology and ontology. The heart of being Yoruba can be understood just by paying attention to the Ifa. And I think it's a relevant example because it also has appearance not in the diaspora. So if you go to places like Brazil, Cuba, and other parts of the Caribbean, you have people who, of course, because of the transatlantic slavery, you have people who are devotees of the Ifa, practitioners of Ifa. And as a DH scholar, I would be interested in websites today that have some of these corpus online to the extent that people who consult these diviners can do so online. How does the technologizing of this important African form, Nigerian form, Yoruba form, how does the technologizing of Ifa help us understand the nature of Yoruba thought and Yoruba philosophy, and help us get a sense of the philosophical structuration of society in a way that is different from what you have in the West? Those are the kind of questions I would be interested in if I were to do a DH project on IFA.
Oh, awesome. And
I'm not sure that answers your question.
No,
I use this as an example just to make the claim and to connect, to take back the discussion to DH1, yeah. And also just to give an example of a cultural and perhaps religious form that might be dismissed, of course, in the West because of its unscientific form and nature. But again, something that has relevance in the context of the lived experiences of a people, and something that's relevant not just within a cultural and religious or even a ritual context, but as a matter of fact, in the context of science itself. Yeah. Because like I said, with its mathematical and scientific basis, you could take Ifa in different directions. I think one of the most tragic consequences of not engaging with a form such as the Ifa is that we're relegated to religious context when it has massive and huge benefits in a scientific environment, such as a Western-oriented mind would really find useful.
Yeah, and I think you're right that. So I think that's a good sort of introduction into this sort of tradition. But yeah, I think it deserves a great deal more exploration than we can give it today. But it's hopefully those listening will look it up, and you mentioned that you might take it on as a
future DH project, we'll say.
Yeah, hopefully. And so turning a little bit back, I want to turn our focus to one of your digital humanities projects, Digital Nollywood. It includes digitizing Nigerian movie posters. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about this project and how you came to taking it on?
Yeah, so I need to start by just noting for those who may not be familiar with Nollywood, that Nollywood is perhaps the second biggest film producing industry in the world after Hollywood. And that means Nollywood produces thousands of films every year. In terms of quantity, in terms of market, Nollywood is really huge. And it's been celebrated over the years as one of the means by which Africans tell their own stories to a global audience, and that's true. Now, I thought to myself at a point that one of the material aspects of the production of Nollywood films was not being taken seriously as we ought to. So, for instance, the video cassettes that were the material foundations that constituted the material foundations of Nollywood's emergence in the 1990s are often easily discarded when we talk about the history of Nollywood. Nobody talks about where those VHS cassettes are anymore. Nobody talks about what happens to the film posters. So in terms of thinking about a kind of museum, a kind of memory institution for the industry, I thought of something to do in the meantime, which seems to me like the easiest. Go to the streets of Lagos, go to the streets of Abuja or the other major Aba or any other major city in Nigeria to curate and collect Nollywood posters and digitize them so that we can at least, to a large extent, have an online repository of film posters on Nollywood, especially films from the past. That way we're able to reconstruct the history of Nollywood using an often neglected aspect of its production, the film posters. So my idea with Digital Nollywood is a scholarly investment in a digital reconstruction of Nollywood's history using film posters. At some point, I imagine I might be interested in collecting old VHS cassettes and looking at some other aspect of its material production that are easily discarded because of our lack of knowledge preservation and record keeping back in a place like Nigeria.
And is this an ongoing project, one that you think can be continuously updated?
Yes. As a matter of fact, at the moment, what I am doing is collecting these posters. In recent times, you have a number of posters appearing online, but some of Nollywood is believed by scholars to have studied in the 90s, 1990, between 1990 and 1992 to be specific. But again, you had a film tradition in Nigeria that predated Nollywood, right? So I'm looking to collect film posters before Nollywood itself, and then film posters when Nollywood started. And then, of course, since Nollywood is still very much with us, I'm committed to collecting as many film posters as possible to have a growing archive of posters that can eventually yield other possibilities for digital research. For instance, I imagine some kind of data visualization project coming out of this movie posters collection in the future.
And where can we find Digital Nollywood?
So that will be www.digitalnollywood.ku.edu.
Great, thank you. After Digital Nollywood, what are some ongoing projects that you have?
So in addition to Digital Nollywood, like I said, it's an ongoing project. I imagine I would be on Digital Nollywood for a couple of years down the line, probably 5, 6. But beyond that, something else I think I might do would be to revisit the University of Kansas Onitsha Market collection. Now, the Onitsha Market collection is a digital collection of literary pamphlets from 1960s and 1970s Nigeria. And to understand Nigerian popular culture, there's a sense in which you need to pay attention to the literary pamphlets that were produced by a network of local publishers in the eastern city of Onitsha in the 60s and 70s. Some of the pamphlets, as a matter of fact, predate Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And of course, Achebe's Things Fall Apart being the seminal and groundbreaking novel that it was, needs to be understood in the context of the production of literary works that I speak of in terms of the Onitsha Market literary collections at the KU library. So my interest in this, and as a matter of fact, like I've joked to anybody who is close to me, I actually accepted the KU job offer because of this literary pamphlet, because of the promise I believe they hold for a robust digital project, which I'm still figuring out.
Yeah.
But at the moment, my sense of what I think will eventually come out of this in terms of a digital project is a digital critical edition of these pamphlets, such that you can have annotations, you can have new texts imagined that can be marked up and made available to the public, and again, perhaps determined for other kinds of research possibilities. The literary scholars, some of the literary scholars who have worked on this pamphlet have appeared over the years, have focused on the nature market literature, saying a lot about gender, or even providing some wealth of knowledge on pre-colonial print culture in Nigeria. What I would love to say is to investigate the possibilities of other thematic areas for research, especially after you have the pamphlets in an open source online database as a new digital edition. So for now, that's what I can see in terms of possibilities of some kind of digital research with the on-nature market literary pamphlets.
And you hope to develop this project or incorporate this project within one of your courses? Is that?
Yes. So currently, like I try to do with my non-DH based courses, I try to incorporate DH methodologies and approaches into my syllabus, and see if students will be interested in learning some digital skills. So for this spring's iteration of my Intro to African Studies class, one of the goals I have is to be able to get students to go to the KU special collection and engage with this literary pamphlet as both as printed objects, printed works, and also see if we can be part of the new phase of digitization the library is proposing. I'll be interested in the students looking at the on-nature collection as looking at the collection in terms of their materiality as printed works, and also understanding what it means for this text to also exist, to also have some form of materiality in their digital form. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you hope, in terms of your pedagogy, what does that add in terms of learning by the students?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to take African studies outside of the classroom. I mean, it could be any class, as a matter of fact. It's my own way of doing experiential learning, right? Get students to do hands-on practical activities that are not classroom bound or conditioned by the speciality of the classroom classroom environment. So getting them to go leave the classroom, engage with some. We could just in the classroom and read a number of the pamphlets online, but I want them to go to the library and see and engage with this text as material artifact, and then be part of the digitization of some of these materials at the KU Special Library.
And just as a way of wrapping up our discussion here, for those researchers, because DH is sort of new and a developing field within academia, and so not everyone will know just exactly how they can embark on a DH project, or just exactly what they can do, or what they're supposed to do when developing a DH project. So I was wondering if you can sort of impart some wisdom or some suggestions for anyone that wants to take on a DH project for the first time?
Well, I don't know if I have any gem of wisdom, not not being the kind of core DH scholar you might find in many other places. But I imagine that the first thing I might tell anybody, especially an Africanist who wants to get into DH, is not to get bogged down by the details of learning new tools and technologies. Just the method of learning to use a software can demobilize somebody who may have some interest. So the first thing is understand the importance of collaboration. You don't have to. Of course, there are times you may need to learn particular tools and software and invest in some technological requirement. But in most cases, I've seen that some of the best DH projects around are a product of collaboration. And while the products may be the focus, sometimes it's also a great idea to focus on the process of producing the particular DH project you have in mind. So I give an example. In 2015, I worked with Alison Murray, was my graduate advisor back in Saskatchewan. She was working on what she called the Grub Street project, and it's a really important work that highlights 18th century street in London, Grub Street. So Alison the project is still ongoing. She's interested in some form of visualization of the history and culture of a particular street in 18th century London through digital mapping. Now, I didn't know much about digital mapping, but just by paying attention and being gently guided by her, I was able to learn some rudimentary aspects of digital mapping, which I believe I can still expand or go back to if I need those skills today. So my point is, of course, there has to be that willingness to learn new tools, but we mustn't get bogged down by or overwhelmed by the anxiety of learning tools and those kind of things. And then also be willing to use the expertise of others as much as possible. Collaborate. And you may be able to get things done that way more effectively than trying to be a lone voice in the field.
Dr. Yeku, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for anyone listening, and hopefully this serves as a nice introduction into digital humanities and can inspire some future work in the field. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of DigitalKS. Thank you.